Chapter 11.
It was not easy work, trying to establish a method of communication with this being out of the past. The weeks went by while Dr. Shaw and Professor Kincaid sought to make contact with the lizard man. His spoken communication eluded them, the high-pitched squeals and hissings seemed to have no specific speech pattern. Perhaps, the professor once remarked, his race communicated by telepathic means. If this were so, no mental messages were received by the scientists. They grimly continued with their blackboard sessions. And slowly they established a fairly complex communication. Fortunately, they were able to feed their strange guest. Plant life appeased his appetite, huge quantities of seaweed and raw vegetation went down his throat daily. Meat did not interest him, his rows of needled teeth acted primarily to shred the plant life he consumed. His intelligence was quickly proved. In very little time he grasped the meanings behind the symbols the scientists scribbled on the chalkboard. His knowledge of the sun, planets, and stars was complete, although he indicated their sizes and orbits in a different manner than did Dr. Shaw. But keep in mind, Professor Kincaid said one day, he lived many millions of years earlier, when this data was probably correct for his time. They developed a simple method of communication by using hand signals. Once the creature understood their purpose, a single raised hand became the means of saying yes and the raising of both hands became no. Other signals were established as well. And then the lizard man began to teach them his own written language. The once meaningless scrawls became associated with objects. He would eagerly pick up the chalk and, holding it awkwardly in his claw-like fingers, would first draw a symbol and then point to an object, thus giving it a written name. The scientists too taught him the English words in printed form. Progress was slow, but the strange man from the past was an apt pupil. By the end of July, they were able to converse with him in writing. They gave him the same of Sa, which was as close as they could come to pronouncing the sound that escaped his jaws. One evening, Dr. Shaw called them all together at his office for a progress report. "Here's what we've learned," he began, leaning back in his chair and lacing his fingers behind his head. Sa's people once lived in a lush, tropical land by a large inland sea. We believe this was during the Cretaceous period, roughly 100 million years ago. There was no North America then. There was no Atlantic Ocean, only a flat and gently rolling plain covered with pine trees, palms, and brilliant flowering shrubs. We have shown Sa pictures of the plant life that exists today, and he has identified magnolias, sassafras, ferns, and willows as being known in his time. His race, the Hadean race, was small. No more than a few thousand of his kind existed, a sort of mutant development. One of nature's experiments that survived for 1,000,000 years or less, just as mankind is another experiment. Apparently, the lizard men were nature's first attempt at intelligent life. They developed great skills, made possible by their fingers and opposing thumbs. They could fashion and hold delicate tools. They built a small city by the shore of the sea. It was a fortress behind which they remained, safe from the gigantic dinosaur and other reptiles that roamed the scrub forests and marshlands. The doctor paused. His fascinated audience waited impatiently for him to continue. He smiled, enjoying the wide-eyed interest on their faces. And then the first earthquake came. It was followed by many others as the earth went through another great change. Somewhere deep in the earth's mantle, the molten rocks slipped and buckled. Incredible pressures were produced and they could only be relieved by the weakest rocks giving way and letting out gigantic explosions of gas and lava. The city of his people was reduced to rubble. Parts of it dropped into the gaping cracks and only a few of his race managed to survive. The flat plains erupted into tumbled mountains and the Atlantic was formed when the inland sea became a vast, boiling ocean. Great quantities of gas would have poisoned the atmosphere for a period. Sa's people had already developed a means of making synthetic diamond, far harder than ours. To protect themselves from the poisoned atmosphere and fiery ash which continued to rain upon them, they built a new city beneath a crystal dome and remained there. They knew it might be centuries before they could dare emerge. For a time, life ceased on the face of the newly formed continent. A few hardy organisms escaped to the north and south, but most of the dinosaur population died away, buried beneath volcanic ash and the oozing mud. With all plant life burned away, the earth became a scorched, dried desert of hardened earth and rock. And then an ice age began, the first of many to follow. The arid lands were buried beneath moving glaciers that reached as far south as where we stand today. Sa's city was on part of a land mass that was broken loose from the shore and sank into the sea. Tightly sealed, the domed city vanished beneath the waves along with its handful of survivors. The city remained intact although many of the inhabitants were killed. With incredible fortitude, these few ancestors of Sa clung to life, buried beneath the ocean. They repaired the dome, and managed to produce their own food synthetically. Sa was born in that underwater city. He never saw the surface, for the dome was eventually covered with silt and plant life and coral. And finally, an unknown disease overcame the population. Sa managed to escape by taking refuge in a hermetically sealed experimental chamber. It was then that he decided to prepare himself for suspended animation, in hopes of surviving the plague and perhaps even awakening at a time in some future era when it would be possible to make his way back to the surface which either he nor any other Hadean of his day had ever seen. He flooded his city with a preservative gas, made his way from the city proper through an outer lock in the experimental chamber which had been his refuge, and somehow managed to reach the crypt where we found him. I believe it was originally intended to serve as the burial monument for the city's most revered scientist, but Sa adopted it for his own needs. Sealing himself within the coffin, he turned on the sleep gas and awaited his eventual reawakening in a more hospitable era. He was to be awakened by a chemical time clock which would react to the proper outside environmental conditions. But it proved faulty. If we hadn't intervened, he might have slept forever. Silence followed the doctor's recitation. Pretty fantastic, isn't it? Jordan looked at his teacher with a strange expression before replying, then his voice was a mere whisper. It raises another question, doesn't it, Doc? Dr. Shaw toyed with his pipe and nodded. Yes. I know what's on all of your minds now. The buried city. Does it still exist somewhere beneath the sea bottom? Well, friends, we're going to try to find that out.